This is the Griffin Realty Group Ask-A-Griffin podcast, episode number 33. As we continue in our series on representation, the question on the table is, what is dual agency? Are you a home seller or buyer who has questions about selling or buying residential property, but you can't find an easy way to get your answers? Well, then you're definitely in the right place. I'm Danny Griffin, the founder of the Griffin Realty Group and the host of the Ask-A-Griffin podcast. Now, to help you take immediate action to get started in the right direction, if you need to sell or buy property right now or in the very near future, you can take advantage of our free step-by-step guides that are waiting for you at griffincourses.com. That's GRIFFIN courses.com. Okay, let's get after this. What is dual agency? And, well, that begs the question, what is a dual agent? Well, let me first give you a little bit of context in the real estate agency and even talk about how we arrive at a dual agent situation where essentially one agent is representing both the seller and the buyer. So its simplest definition is that. But how does that arrive? How do we arrive at that situation? Well, see, once upon a time, the multiple listing service, also known as the marketplace for residential properties. And if you need an analogy to make a comparison, think about the stock market, the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange. These are all marketplaces where information is stored so that decisions, in that case financial decisions, can be made about investing. Commodity markets are the same. So this mass amount of information is stored in a marketplace, now largely digital. Well, in that digital age, you have the internet that is just absolutely craving more information to give away directly to the public. And the pressure to crack into that marketplace in real estate was so strong that ultimately, with the founding of a company called Realtor.com, which was actually a private company, private tech company out of the West Coast, they actually set up an arrangement with the National Association of Realtors to give away the access to that information. Now, if you remember, for years and years and years, this had been a proprietary marketplace where the paying members, also known as realtors, that's the difference between a real estate agent and a realtor, somebody who had joined a board, the National Association, and then a local multiple listing service where the information was kept. It was all proprietary to agents and agencies. And if you were a buyer, you had to go to that agent or agency to get access to the information. And then all of a sudden, one day, it was out there. So the buyers were excited. They didn't have to go through this intermediary when they were just whimsically beginning their process, or they were serious about their process. Wherever they were in the continuum of buying a property, they could now get access to property information. I'm going to emphasize that. It's access to property information and an enormous amount of details. So now the sifting and sorting is the burden of the buyer now. It's no longer the job or the burden of the buyer's agent in that case, or at least the perception goes. And this is the dilemma. So there's a false perception that if I have access to information, I can interpret that information better than I'll leave it at this, a good buyer's agent. And furthermore, if I do, quote unquote, my own homework on this public information, I'll just simply go directly to the listing agent and I'll be able to get a discount. And these are all presumptions and assumptions that may not be true, and they might be true. But it's this false sense of maybe it's even a little bordering on hubris that, well, I can do better than an agent can do, and I'll just go directly here and I'll talk to that agent. And here's what I would say to all of you that think like that. Just beware, you might be right. I'm not going to argue with you, the small percentage of you that need to be right. But I want you to think about that. When you go directly there, you have to ask yourself, what agency formula am I entering into? And it's called dual agency if, only and if, and this is the second point in this podcast here, only if that dual representation is in writing and understood not only by you, who has some ulterior motive for going direct. Maybe you think that because you're coming direct, the agent's making more because they're making two pieces of the pie versus one, and you're not wrong about that incentive. It's certainly on the table. Let's not shy away from it. And that you think you can get some of that back in a discount because you went directly. You also might be right. But now the seller who's being represented by that listing agent has to agree to this. There has to be something that's in it for them as well. And I'll just leave it at that because you can't get into every scenario where it may or it may not be, but financially it might be beneficial to all parties, but you just don't know that. But here's the thing that's happening. You believe that all that just basic information, I know where the house is, I know who the listing agent is, I can call them directly, I can get in there, and then I can perhaps get a better financial deal. Or I can even cut the line and get advantage over others. All you agents out there better be careful of that. Your fiduciary responsibility is still to make sure that you help the seller do the best that they can too. So it becomes a very tricky situation. Now, there is an alternative to this, especially in Massachusetts, called designated agency. And I'm not going to get into that. But this is the one where one person is truly in the middle, not quite a facilitator. There's still this responsibility about material disclosures, okay, and guidance. But we're in this tough spot now. And the real question is, what is the true ultimate benefit to you as the buyer if you don't know insightful information about that property, about the marketplace? I know you might be an analyst in the job that you do, but do you really have the real access to the real data and information in multiple listing service? That's not the same as a bunch of properties. You also may not have the experience to analyze that data. A lot of agents don't. A lot of agents don't work on their craft and they don't dive in to analyze what that math says. I had the wonderful benefit of spending some time in an analytical capacity in a Wall Street firm. So I understood that when you have data, you can make it talk and tell the story. But you have to look at it, analyze it, and know how to do that. So the likelihood that you as a busy person trying to buy a property, even if you're super intelligent, have the time to do that, or have the time to get the experience to analyze that, might happen, might not. But for the majority of you, it's not going to happen. So you have to outweigh or weigh against each other or compare the benefit of going directly to somebody and the benefit of getting somebody to interpret this information. But more importantly, this is not an event. And I think that's the thing that everybody forgets. This is not an event. I look at the information, I walk in and buy it. This is a process. And the reason we started off our buyer series here in the podcast about representation is because for the buyer, that's not so obvious. On the sell side, it's obvious. If I come to list your property, I'm going into a listing contract with you. And so not only are we bound together, the property is bound to us too. So it's obvious. Whereas with buyer representation, there are some states that really push buyer agency agreements. There are others that don't necessarily. Some agents adhere to it, some don't. But it's more important to understand that what is the value in representation? Or what should it be? Because if it's a process, what about being pre-qualified for the loan before you go in? Because remember, if I'm the seller and I'm sitting there and saying, great, wonderful that he came direct to you as the agent, but where's the pre-qualification letter? What do you know about this person that just came off the street? See, if you as a buyer had taken the time to understand the process, or better yet, an agent or agency had helped you understand it, the first thing a good representative does is say, look, let's get your money in order. Let's get a pre-approval letter from your lending institution so that when the offer is presented, they can see your financial strength because they don't know you. To which you say, I'm paying cash. Well, wonderful. That's fine too. But I'm going to need a letter from the manager of the financial institution that simply states that you have the wherewithal to complete a cash transaction in a short period of time in this price range. You see, that's the second part of the process. The third part of the process is to slow down the process and say, look, let's take a look at what that money you have just been pre-qualified for or have determined you're going to pay in cash. What does that money buy? And let's get into that MLS and start looking for sold property. See, you didn't think about all this, did you? So that's the point of this, is that I have no problem with dual agency if everybody puts it in writing and there's a mutual benefit to both buyer and seller, and the agent can navigate it by being a good fiduciary and being responsible to all parties, disclosing material information to the positive and negative as required by law. Wonderful. That's great. But let's just all be aware of the entirety of this process that's happening, not looking at these micro reasons why we might do this. Now, also, let me just say in the last point here, it's best for the dual agent to stick to the material facts. That's the best thing, right? Don't get down in, if you're going to be a dual agent, don't get down into a lot of, well, I think I would, and I would, you're losing that ability when you chunk yourself up to dual agency. That's why I like designated agency. I prefer that because I can designate somebody at my company when the buyer comes directly to deal with them, to do an analysis for them. So if you declare that as an agency, I am the designated agent for the listing. But if the buyer comes directly and wants representation, we have a designated agent at that company. So it's perfect because we don't have to give up anything in representing either party. So I like that the best. But if you're a dual agent, stick to the material facts. And here's what I think is really important. Delegate conflicts of interest. This is the key point. There will be conflicts of interest at some point in time. And what I would say is it's best to tell everybody up front when you get representation for dual agency in writing or permission for such. You want to also suggest, I would also suggest you both acquire the services of a competent attorney. I think a lot of the states too, not necessarily Massachusetts, but other states where escrow companies do such a great job of facilitating everything and making it the closing go smoothly. I just think we forget that we're entering into a legal contract. And for agents and agencies, we typically have a fill in the blank, pre-approved, legalized form that happened in conjunction with Massachusetts law, in my case, and the legal community. So it's been pre-approved, but we're really only supposed to fill in the blanks. So when you're entering into these contracts, I think it's very important to understand that there might be a conflict of interest. So it's best to have attorneys. In fact, regardless of agency, we always recommend to our buyers and sellers that they be represented in this transaction. And we always say, don't be penny wise and pound foolish trying to save the X number of hundreds of dollars to be represented during the contract phase, also known as the closing phase, which we'll get into. You want representation. So that way, as a dual agent, I could, if I were playing that situation, I could sit there and coordinate like an orchestra leader, but the attorneys would be responsible for going back and forth to resolve the conflict of interest, especially if it's contractual. All right, so let's review these points. What is dual agency? That begs the first question, what's a dual agent? And that is an agent who in one singular transaction for this podcast is representing both the buyer and the seller. The second point is dual representation must be in writing. And I would add, and understood by both buyer, seller, and agent. Should just be slowed down, have a conversation. If there's tri-party in that case, three parties, buyer, seller, agent, if there's mutual benefit and everybody understands what it is, wonderful, but get it in writing. But as a safety net, the third point was, it's best for the dual agent to stick to the material facts, the major facts, the obvious facts, and delegate some responsibility, especially with the legalese, to protect against conflict of interest matters to the seller and the buyer's attorney. That's very important, I think. All right? So let me review it this way. Many buyers are still of the habit of wanting to contact listing agents directly and not engage the services of a dedicated buyer's agent. However, if both buyer and seller agree to buyer agency or dual agency, then it must be in writing. And it's best to suggest that both buyer and seller have legal representation for the remainder of the contract. All right, now remember, you can take immediate action to get started in the right direction if you need to sell or buy property right now or in the very near future by getting our free step-by-step guides at griffincourses.com. That's GRIFFIN courses.com. Now, that's exactly what we were just talking about. The course, the buyer course, the process, That's exactly where you can get a copy of the process, okay? You get an infographic and a little video walkthrough. Also, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen so that you don't miss out on any insights each time we upload. We also post all of our episodes on our social media channels, so remember to turn on your notifications for Griffin Realty Group. We have a nice little gold label that looks like the mythical beast, the Griffin. You won't miss it, and then you won't miss the reminders. We'd also appreciate it if you would share our content with other people just like you so that they get the help that they need when they need it. Thanks for listening, but remember this, nobody's coming for you. So take action and get to work on your own plan for buying or selling residential property, and we'll see you in the next episode.